I understand that you've worked for a long time directing, producing, and designing for major theater companies like Collective Unconscious in New York. And now you're celebrating over a decade as executive director of Lumberyard. Congratulations on that milestone. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Now, tell us, what is Lumberyard exactly? I understand it's a space for technical rehearsal for performance artists. Am I right about that?
Yes, that's correct. In 2015, we purchased an abandoned, or actually an active lumberyard in Catskill that was for sale. It had been a lumberyard since the late 1800s. And at the time, we were looking for a space that we could build, the first of its kind in the US, that could be basically solely dedicated to technical rehearsals, meaning that time in the rehearsal process where artists come together to integrate design and technology into the work that eventually ends up on stages across the country. And that time is so expensive that our hope was, if we could build a space dedicated to that part of the rehearsal process, we could achieve an economies of scale that would allow for artists to do it at a lower price point, which was desperately needed in the field.
So could you step us through, Adrienne, what exactly is technical rehearsal for those of us who don't know much about it?
Well, traditionally, before I'd say maybe 15, even 10 years ago, the traditional process for a theater piece that you might see off Broadway or in regional theater would have been several weeks in a rehearsal studio, mostly in Manhattan, which would have been, 4 walls, lights on, lights off, where the choreographer, the director would be working with the movements on stage and working with the actors, with script analysis and that type of rehearsal. And then everybody would come together in the theater for a week. And that's when the lighting designer and the sound designer and the costume designers all come together with the actors or whoever's, performing, if it's dancers or actors. And you would have a week to put all those elements together. And sometimes it was less than that, 3 days.
Right. So it's like all the people in technical production, like doing the lighting, doing the sound, they come in kind of towards the end, right?
Right. And that was really and it still is in large part, the scenario for script-based work. So work that has a playwright, it's chosen from a literary office in a theater, and that's the traditional method for a lot of script-based work. And then the way that work was being made, particularly in New York City, was shifting. And there was a lot of devised theater and performance art. And there was the future of the field really is melding forms. So
right. So mixing dance with theater, mixing, theater with music or whatever that may be.
Right. And also incorporating design and technology much earlier on in the process. So now you might see the set designers and the lighting designers and sound designers in the room from the very start. And that means that the traditional rehearsal spaces that are just plain boxes with lights up and lights down really no longer serve that process. Right. And actors choreographers and directors are always really pushing to find space where they can work with their designers. But it is very expensive, because if you're not going to come to a place that's dedicated for it, like Lumberyard, then you have to rent out a theater. You have to find a warehouse that you can load in the lights and the set and have the opportunity to work with technology. A lot of universities are thankfully offering this. Right. And you can go to a university, but you often have to work around student schedules.
Right.
So it was before we started this, we did a study of the field to see what was really the biggest roadblock for new work to get made. And this was one of the recurring themes that every artist who is making work spoke about.
Right. So Lumberyard then provides this kind of vital, rare resource for performance artists. I'm just curious to know, on a larger level, is this type of practice of rehearsal and that sort of traditional format you talked about, is that something you see commonly just in the United States? Do you see that in other countries? And what does it look like, say, globally, when people want to do technical rehearsals? Does it work differently?
It does. part of everything is driven by cost. So the biggest barrier to artists being able to take risks and realize their visions is cost. And in some countries or in other areas of the world, there's a lot more support for the performing arts. And you see innovation in the arts funded more. So if you go to areas like Berlin or Tel Aviv, or even Shanghai or other cities where the artists have years to work in the space to develop their work, it's just a very different process. And it's almost not even comparable to what we have here.
Right.
Because for an artist, unless they're able to build their own space somewhere, they don't have that access. And if they do, it's because they have access to considerable resources, which would be few and far between.
Yeah, Adrienne, that's such an interesting point. And I'm wondering, tell us a little bit too about some of your background, because you have a background as a creator and not just as an administrator. And I'm wondering your years of experience doing the designing and the production and the directing side of things. Do you think that those experiences have fed into your role now as executive director at Lumberyard? And if so, how?
Definitely. I think, well, ever since even when I was in college as an undergrad, I was hired by the theater department to oversee the technical rehearsals for the student and faculty productions, because I understood in that moment when everything comes together that there is a way for it to happen more seamlessly that allows for experimentation without going over the cost or going over budget. And it was always a really exciting part of the rehearsal process for me. And I was also particularly excited when I was able to work with directors who were able to really create a world for the piece to live in, which meant that lights and sound and design were all incorporated very early on and considered, and they weren't last minute add-ons. And I think my experience being able to work with directors who work like that, or working with theaters who were able to focus on making work in that way, was it was almost kind of ahead of its time, and knowing and being able to understand the direction that the field was going in.
Right.
And
right. So noticing these huge shifts in that whole entire field.
Yes, and we still haven't figured out how to support that and build the infrastructures for that, because so many institutions that exist to support artists right now are older, and they haven't really had the chance to adapt to the changing the forms and the fields. They just haven't had the opportunity to. And philanthropy, which is private philanthropy, is the main source of funding for so many nonprofit performing artists, and they haven't made the shift either.
Right. It's making me think, Adrienne, you're talking about even, philanthropic foundations, for instance, they're technically plugged into the performing arts on some level. I'm kind of wanted to step back a little bit farther and think bigger picture even about, some Americans might see what performance artists do as something that doesn't have like a lot of consequence, or that it's separate from society. And I'm wondering, on a larger level, why is it so important to enable the performance arts, like say through resources that Lumberyard provides or whatnot? How is it important for people, those of us who maybe don't make art ourselves? I
talk so much about how important the performing arts are on a community level, particularly where we are located. But on a larger level, there is definitely a disconnect between what the performing arts was meant to reflect for us as a country. And there's so much emphasis on different sources of American power throughout the world. There's hard power, which is, traditionally military and economics. But then there's the soft power, which has always been diplomacy and culture. And I think that, film and television in the US has always been a great product for culture and our soft power. But in terms of live performance, I really think there's a disconnect between the American way, the American spirit, the spirit of innovation and breaking boundaries and trying new technologies. We've lost that in the performing arts because there's such a barrier to be able to achieve that, because it's so expensive. And we haven't been able to build the support structures to allow artists to truly innovate. And
Right.
we've been at Lumberyard, we produced a white paper to talk about this problem a year ago, where we said that American artistic innovation was in crisis. And I think as a field, we need to find ways to work together to support this, so that it's not just the companies that have been around for 40 years and have access to considerable amounts of funding. It's also a young artist who wants to start, right out the gate, can start working in a way that reflects the field and the direction of the field.
Right, right. Those are great points, Adrienne. And tell us a bit about what's been going on now at Lumberyard, or any kinds of programs or residencies that may be coming up in the near future.
So we made a decision during COVID. We used to have summer seasons where artists would come to us and show the work that they were premiering in New York in the fall. They would be showing in the city in the fall. They would do it with us in the summer, and they would get a week or 2 weeks where they could get the work ready and have access to technical rehearsals. When the pandemic started, it became clear to us that we couldn't do both. We couldn't have public performances and have technical rehearsals simultaneously and still keep a safe building with health protocols. So we redesigned elements of the building, because we have 13 bedrooms on site, and we have the large performance space, so that it was a safe place for artists to come back to work. And there were a lot of they called them bubble residencies throughout the country, where artists could come together to a remote location and work. But there weren't any that allowed you to work with design and technology and really work on the technical aspects.
Right.
So in December 2020, we were able to open for these rehearsals, and week after week, we have had artists in there working on the technical aspects of their show, and they've been in with their designers, and it's been great to see that level of work beginning again. When I walked in the other day, it was great to just see a room filled with designers and artists in another room rehearsing, while there was a group of designers in the theater. And that's what made me feel like we were getting closer to coming back.
Right. Things were still cooking in the pot, right? That's a good feeling. Yeah, yeah.
We've had artists who are working on works that are going to be touring internationally. We've had artists come in that have works that are going to be premiering in New York, hopefully in the fall or the spring. So things are starting to get ready.
That's fantastic.
It's been a consistent stream, because the need for technical rehearsals in a safe environment is greater now today than it ever has been.
Great. Adrienne, thank you so much for being on A House for Arts. It's such a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, thank you. It was great.